Good morning. I'm Father Tom Malionic. I'm the rector of St. Paul's Church in Kinderhook, New York, and we are here this morning for another morning of musings. This is episode 88. I guess episode's the right word. And I'm just now realizing to my horror that I forgot to let the folks on Facebook know. So if somebody is inclined to do so, if you've been here before and you've heard the introductory spiel that I give, maybe this would be a good time, if you wouldn't mind, to zip over to Facebook and at least post something that says Morning Musings is on YouTube this morning. And that way anybody who comes and shows up looking will be reminded, because I forgot. And my apologies for that. Anyway, we are here for Morning Musings, and we muse in the morning because there is much to muse on. God gives us all kinds of blessings, all kinds of means of grace, as we give thanks for them in the general thanksgiving that we say at the end of morning prayer and in the prayer book at the end of evening prayer. It could be anything. It could be passages of Scripture, perhaps, and this has been the inspiration all along for us, has been the passages of Scripture that we encounter in our praying the daily office, morning prayer in particular, because we're right after that and it's fresh in our minds. But it could be anything. It could be a point of doctrine. It could be the occasion, the saint of the day. It will be today. We're going to talk a little bit about Saint Jerome today. It could be something that has piqued your curiosity or your interest, something that about our liturgical practices, perhaps, or our devotional tradition. It could be anything. So we're happy to take up anything. And if you have things like that you like to see addressed, I don't guarantee that I can address them or that I can do so well, but I can certainly put it out there. And again, we're all sort of, we're all here to rely on one another and to use one another's best gifts in how we learn to become a people, not just individuals, but a people following Jesus Christ, so that we become better representatives, so that our church here, our little church in Kinderhook, becomes a better sort of touchstone, a better place, a better thin place where people can see not just the church, but see sort of into it and through it see us, and in seeing us, see not us as the flawed individuals we are, but rather as representations and as windows, like icons, into the Christ who lives within us. And having seen Christ, they see the Father. And that closes the loop. That gets done what God the Father wants done. It gets done what the Creator wants done with with creation, including created humanity. So that's what we're here to do. We're here to learn how to do that better. We're here to learn, and in most cases, what it really means is learning how not to do the things that get in the way of that. So a lot of what we talk about and a lot of what we do is about letting go. It's not about achieving. It's not about great grand plans, but it's about that discipline of letting go of ourselves and letting go of our concern for ourselves and what we want and what we like and what we love, but rather just to simply acquire that wonderful flexibility that lets us be blown on the winds of the Holy Spirit without being blown by every other wind that comes along, but allows us to float on the winds of the Spirit and to blow from God knows where to God knows whence. God knows whence to God knows whither, sorry. So we're here for that. That's what our morning musings are about. So thank you for joining us, and I appreciate it. And we are on YouTube, so I don't have anywhere near the kind of feedback. I think I actually might be able to see something, but I don't. Okay, never mind. So all right, so that's the thing. That's where we are right now. So I'm sorry for the errors in making the transition here this morning. We'll get better at that. A couple of things that I think jumped out certainly at me, and maybe there are other things that jumped out at you, but things that jumped out to me today in our gathering together for morning prayer. One of them was the psalm. It's a harsh sounding psalm, and I tried to get across in the way I read it, which was not our usual just sort of monotone kind of back and forth recitation of psalm verses, but rather to get into what is actually being said there, and to realize that there's a change of voice in that psalm that happens a few verses in. It starts out with the psalmist talking and complaining that the wicked has arisen against me, right? And you got to keep in mind that there's a singular, that the wicked there is a singular person. It is not all the wicked, right? There's a he there, not a they. We go back and forth. It gets a little fuzzy, but for most of the section that sounds so harsh, let his fatherless children wander in the streets, and let everybody remember his mother's sins, and all of that. All of that is actually a recitation or a quotation of what the psalmist reports that the wicked is saying about him, right? So a lot of that, and those are curses, right? Let his name be blotted out. Let his sins be remembered before God. Those are curses, right? That's what we do when we curse somebody. So let something bad happen to you. Those are the curses. And that's what the psalmist is upset about. And that's why the psalmist has come to God, because people are cursing him. This person is cursing him. And then there's a turnaround. And then the psalmist turns around and says, well, let the shame come on him, God. Let him be the one who is ashamed. And then there's this wonderful casting. The psalmist casts himself upon the mercy of God. I am poor. I am needy. I have nothing to rely on here. So that it's important though to highlight it, and it's hard to know exactly where it transitions back to the psalmist's plea. Of course, the way Hebrew is written, there's no certainly in the original manuscripts from which our current oldest manuscripts are copied. Our current oldest manuscripts already have introduced things like word breaks and indications of paragraphs and so on, chapters, and there are no verses as yet in those oldest Hebrew manuscripts. But it's kind of a judgment call to tell where one leaves off and the other picks up and begins. So there's around verse 14 and 15. There's a little bit of a transition there. Let me go back there to verse. It's pretty clear. It's pretty clear that the wicked person is cursing the psalmist when he says, "Let the wickedness of his fathers be remembered before the Lord, and his mother's sin not be blotted out. Let their sin be always before the Lord, and let him root out their names from the earth." So presumably the psalmist and his mother and his ancestors, his fathers. And then there's that verse 15, because he did not remember to show mercy. And I think there's some question there as to whether that is why God is supposed to root out the psalmists, root the psalmist's name out from the earth. Is that the psalmist's sin that should always be remembered before the Lord? He persecuted the poor and needy. He sought to kill the brokenhearted. It's questionable there who is doing that, because it sounds to me anyway as if this is now the psalmist taking over again the narrative and recovering the first person, because he, the person who's cursing me, so that instead of that being an explanation of verse 14 that follows, let their sin be always before the Lord because he did not remember to show mercy, but rather it's the beginning of a new section in which the psalmist says, because he did not remember to show mercy, he loved cursing, let it come upon him. So I've made the choice to sort of group things that way. I don't think I actually even read it that way this morning. But I think upon thinking about it, that's where the break ought to be. So verse 15, we're recovering the psalmist's voice here. But again, in terms of, that's neither here nor there. In terms of what's going to help us in our living of the gospel, again, here we have somebody who is being slandered. Here we have somebody who is being cursed, and maybe with some reason. There's certainly, the psalmist isn't claiming to be pure and sinless and 100% innocent, and he's certainly still living in a time when family associations carried with them a certain amount of guilt by association. So he's laboring under this, the weight of these curses, and we do that too. We find ourselves the victims of gossip. We find ourselves trying to slog on and be, as faithful as we can to Christ, while others sit on the sidelines and critique us, and not even to deliver helpful, constructive criticism to us, but simply to wish that we were gone, to wish that we were different, to wish that we were better, or that we were more like what they are used to, or more like what they are like. And they're talking about that amongst themselves. And so it builds up an atmosphere in which it becomes very hard for a people to come together. That's what gossip does. That's what that sort of third-party communication does. You may have heard me use the word triangulation, right? Where if I have a problem with you, I don't deal with you, I go to somebody else and complain about you. That's gossip. That's triangulation, the only thing that does is that makes me feel a little bit less anxious. I feel like I've got an ally here. I've got somebody who shares my dislike, my distaste, my sense of grievance, perhaps, or righteous indignation, or whatever it happens to be. But nevertheless, I have an ally. So it's you and me against so-and-so over there. That builds up an unhealthy dynamic within any community. And that's what we are constantly having to deal with in any kind of community life, and especially in a church. When there are factions that meet outside or that separate themselves from the whole unity of the church, we've already got a problem long before it manifests itself in any particular accusation or any particular issue. We've already got a problem if that is not understood to be a bad thing in and of itself. We are already setting ourselves up for discord, for dissension, for a failure to be able to move ahead as a unit, and for loss of our strength, loss of our the strength that comes from. You've heard me quote this work before, and I should remember to put the title up and a link to it. A long obedience in the same direction. That's what the church is. The church is a group of people who have been obedient for a long time, all of them the same way, all facing the same direction, all going the same way, staying together, not letting some fall way behind and not getting way out ahead either, but recognizing, of course, that that there's a certain division of labor that happens. There are people bring their own particular gifts, but they bring these gifts not so that they can be, again, applauded for having them, but to use them for the benefit of the group, sometimes, again, to the dismay of part of the group. But it's the union, the unity, the communion, the staying together, the rehearsing together, we all do the same things at the same time sort of discipline that brings us forward as the church down through the centuries. It is why 20 centuries after Jesus Christ, there is still a church. It is why we still have the scriptures that we do, and they are still faithful to what was delivered, to the faith that was delivered in those earliest days. That we still have the revelation of God to the chosen people in much the same form in which it was revealed to the chosen people. And whether there was something else before that or behind it, and what we have is a distortion in some ways, if we discover other documents, we take those into consideration and deal with them. But for as long as we have what we have, we take that as our basis. We take as our basis something firm and that is reliable and that is communicable precisely because it is outside of ourselves. It doesn't rely on our own subjective perceptions, but rather, we trust, we have faith, we accept. So that takes us really kind of out of the psalm, past the psalm, into the Acts of the Apostles, because this is exactly what's happening with Paul. He has gone to Jerusalem. He is going to confer with the church in Jerusalem, the original disciples, James, who is the head of the church now in Jerusalem. Peter has presumably gone off on mission somewhere. He may be around, he may be in the picture, but James is the head of the church in Jerusalem. He is their, what will become known as bishop. But we see what Paul is laboring under, and we've seen it before. When he has gone around on his missions, he gets attacked. People don't like what they think he is doing to their faith. And there's so many things wrong with that sentence. There's so many things wrong with that whole idea. That it is Paul's doing, for one thing. They misconstrue what their faith is and should be. Jesus Christ has been at pains, and we see it over and over again in the readings we've had at Sunday Mass, that Jesus is relentlessly exposing how particularly the current state of religion in Jerusalem under the corrupt leadership of the current high priestly families and the current cult of the temple, the Sadducees, with their general casual attitude towards religion as long as it pays for itself, and keeps up a sense of beauty and ethnic pride, or the Pharisees who have a subjective interpretation that has worked. It did work. It was good. It kept Israel from becoming completely assimilated in Babylon and Persia and Assyria. It kept Israel's identity alive, and it kept that awareness of the covenant alive. And so the Pharisees, but again, they thought it would last, and they're trying to make it last. When Jesus is saying, yeah, okay, we're ready to move to the next level now. And the Pharisees are like, oh no, we've got it. We've already got it. We're just going to keep doing things the way we learned how to do them. Imagine somebody who still drives today the way they drove when they were 16 and first got their driver's license. Has not, that experience hasn't had any moderating effect on those habits or ways of going about things, that there has been no overall gradual improvement. Any number of things, right? Someone who's, takes a year of Spanish and then, that's the extent of their knowledge, and yet they go off and insist that that's a good enough knowledge of Spanish for all intents and purposes, or English for that matter. So it takes a lot to overcome that tendency that we have, and it's particularly strong in our culture in our day, to subjectivism. That we have these little, we walk around like little universes, entitled to exist on our own by ourselves without reference to other universes, and that we can voluntarily disown other universes. And everybody's embedded in their own little universe and trying to keep that universe from being exposed to the light of the Creator's truth, the Creator's plan, the Creator's reality. And this is what Paul is up against. There has been gossip about Paul. They tell him, they say, look, people are here, and they've heard what's going on in your missions, and they think you're out to destroy Judaism. Paul, over and over again, makes the case. He writes to the Romans, he writes to, in several of his letters, he protests, look, I'm a Pharisee's Pharisee. We're going to see that passage come up very soon, I think, in the next week. I'm the Pharisee's Pharisee. There's nobody who is more Jewish than me. How would you say? I was circumcised on the 8th day. I have been like this since my youth. I was a star pupil of Gamaliel. I was on the fast track to chief rabbi. And I mean, if I show more attention, pay more attention, or show more, lavish more attention on the Gentiles, it's only so that my fellow Jews will get jealous, and maybe some of them will rejoin this great movement following this Messiah that has now been revealed to Israel. This is a son of David. This is the one who was foretold. The scriptures point to him. In his ministry to the Gentiles, he doesn't bring that out very much because they don't have that background of being the chosen people and having those revelations, those prophecies. So Christ comes to them from a different direction slightly, without being able to build up that foundation underneath. But what Paul is trying to do is saying, yeah, okay, that's your foundation, but build on it now. Don't just live on the bare rock. Here's Christ who has come. Let's build an edifice. He wants to build an edifice here. He's building his Father's house here so that we can all enter it. He's leading the way into his Father's house. However you want to envision that. I think the image of a journey to a distant place is probably a little bit closer as a metaphor for us, but nevertheless, that Jesus Christ's mission here is to bring us all not just physically into a place where the circumstances are better, but to make us fit for those circumstances, and not just fit to enjoy them, but fit to help build them and help expand them and bring others into them, and so on. That's what Jesus Christ is about with us. He's making us into little images, little icons of himself, so that we point to him and he points to the Father, and everybody gets there. That's God's plan, is to follow this path. And Paul is dealing with people who are saying, no, he's leading people astray from the law of Moses, the path of Moses. And the Christian teaching, granted, this didn't get emphasized for centuries, but that at its root, and certainly we're recovering this now today, a little bit more, this awareness that this is all still the mission to the chosen people. This is all still about God having singled out a people to be especially his own, so that all people could become especially his own, so that we could all be grafted on. Anyway, Paul is dealing with gossip. He's dealing with people who are spreading rumors about him. And so he goes and he does, he takes the advice to do something that will show he is not in fact trashing Judaism. And even the church in Jerusalem recognizes that the Gentiles have got to have a different deal. They've got to have a different way of accepting Jesus Christ. They're not under the Mosaic law. They are not the original chosen people to whom the law of Moses or the covenant on Sinai was delivered. They have been offered a different covenant. They've been offered a covenant in the Spirit, as have the Jews, as have the chosen people. They too have been offered a covenant in the Spirit now, just as they were offered successive covenants down through the ages. There was the covenant with Noah. There's the covenant on Sinai. God continually renews and expands and broadens those covenants. So this is the latest in a succession of covenants that God makes. They don't overturn the previous ones, but they sort of swallow them up and carry them forward, and it's too much to try to tease out every last thread of this. But this is where we are. This is why we are. It's why we're here. Um, so we have Paul in Acts, and I think the other thing that we have to recognize with this tendency that crops up repeatedly in human communities to pair up, to gravitate into factions, um, to not take into consideration the whole, but instead say, no, we over here, we're the ones that you should listen to. We're the ones that should have influence or favor. It takes work, and it takes sacrifice, and it takes self-abnegation, self-denial to overcome that. It takes hard work to preserve even if there's some factual basis to whatever's being gossiped about, it takes work to preserve the integrity of the original report, to deal only with the facts, and to situate it in the context not of expediency, not of problem solving, but of supernatural love, of a love that is greater than what we would naturally engage in. You've heard me say this all over and over, if you've listened to me preach or to speak at all, that it is not about what comes naturally to us. It is about what God enables us to do that takes us beyond what we can do naturally, takes us beyond what we are naturally thinking and feeling, the intuitions that are interior to us that come up out of our own spirit, our own sense of where our limitations and weaknesses are, but instead to allow God to give us a different set of a different vocation, a different strengths, perhaps new strengths, unexpected strengths we did not know we have, strengths we have not worked for. Those are gifts of the Holy Spirit that are given to us, that enable us to operate in ways we would never have deemed imaginable for ourselves. So, but in terms of, and also in terms of the sin that we have, because we're going to move on into Saint Jerome here, and this is the segue. That there's a sinfulness in the sense of alienation, sinfulness in the sense of missing the mark, and not. Think of it this way: if sin is indeed missing the mark, and that's really what the word means in both Greek and Hebrew. The idea that sin is missing the mark. You have a target, you shoot an arrow, it doesn't get there. That's missing the mark. That's sin. Doesn't matter whether it was your aim was wrong, the bow was bad, the arrow was warped, or the wind took it off course. Blaming something is not the issue. It is the fact that the arrow did not connect with the target. That's missing the mark. And so, you've heard me talk about my definition of sin, that sin is, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And I stand by that. That is a good characterization of sinful acts or sinful omissions, right? It seemed like a good idea at the time. Okay, now we know it didn't hit the mark. But there's also sin that is a condition, and sinfulness is probably the better way to put it. But we use the same word sin for both the manifestation and the interior disposition, the attitude, the thoughts, the feelings, the ideas, the commitments, the priorities, the whatever it happens to be, the reasoning, the rationalization, all of that stuff that goes on inside. All of that is a manifestation of this stubborn tendency that human beings have had since the very earliest challenge that they faced in the garden. That tendency that all of humanity has, individually and corporately, again and again, to put mere nature ahead of the design and will of the Creator for created reality. Saint Jerome is famous for having said at one point that to be ignorant of Scripture is to be ignorant of Christ. Right? That there is no Christ apart from what is revealed about Christ, about him in the Word of God. There is a union. Again, there's not a missing of the mark, but a hitting of the mark, a joining of intention and realization, a joining of intention and outcome that God brings about. There is a union between the divine and the human in Jesus. There is a union between the word written in the scriptures and the word incarnate in Jesus Christ, the word that was made flesh and dwelt among us. It still takes work. Before we move on actually to Jerome, I think it again bears repeating here that it takes work for us to understand that word, in the sense that we can't just expect it to sort of stumble over it and recognize it. If you trip on something and you fall, your first reaction is rarely, "Oh, I'm glad that was there." Right? If you trip on something and it throws you off course, or it throws you for a loop, your first reaction to it is probably to curse it. Your first reaction is to think this is a bad thing. And maybe afterwards, upon reflection, you realize, oh, that's the thing I was looking for all along. Right? That's the rock I was looking for. It was my stumbling block, literally, a rock that we put in path. The word stumbling block, that comes up in Scripture a lot. Maybe worth saying a word about that. A stumbling block is a caltrop. It's something that you put in the way of an enemy to trip them up, to prevent them from getting forward, to make their horses fail. Right? That's what a stumbling block is. It's a barrier that's put in someone's way to cause them to fall and hurt themselves, so that they are then less likely to be able to carry out a successful attack against you. That's what a stumbling block is. And Jesus Christ is viewed as a stumbling block. He's viewed as an impediment to salvation, to the salvation of Israel, to the restoration of God's universe to the plan that God originally has for the universe. Always, it was the best one from the beginning, and it's still the best one, and God is still going to make that happen. But it takes reflection. It takes work to sit there as we rub our sore knees and our bruised elbows, to think about the fact that the thing we tripped over was precisely the thing that we needed. That when Paul is struck and cast to the ground on the road to Damascus, his first thought was not, "Oh, good, here's God." His first thought was, "What's going on?" Right? This is some terrible thing that has befallen me. It takes a while before we realize that this is God at work, and sometimes it isn't God at work. But when God does intrude in our lives to try to reorient us, to try to make us go in another direction, it feels like an impediment. It feels like an obstacle. And it takes time and reflection, and again, discipline, to get over the hurt, to get over the annoyance, the dismay, the anger, the frustration of the plans we thought we had, to recognize that this is exactly what we need here. It takes work to do that. It takes work to see the unity, to see where something has hit the mark instead of missed it. So this plays out in Hosea. Here, Hosea has taken the disastrous step of marrying a woman for whom marriage and a stable marriage, fidelity to one man for a lifetime, has not been her pattern. And Hosea has been instructed by God, if you will. Hosea, I'm sure, falls in love with her. There's no indication that he doesn't actually love this woman. This is not a dutiful, sterile act of detached symbolism. Right? He goes out and falls in love with this woman and marries her. They have children, right? And there's all kinds of difficulties that arise precisely because the habits of a lifetime are hard to overcome. So when Hosea, in the passage that we heard today, delivers these scathing condemnations, two things we have to work at. First of all, we have to get over the fact that this is just about the human physical sexual side of prostitution. Right? We have to get over that. We have to get over that attitude, for one thing. But we also have to get over the opposite temptation, which is to think that it's only a metaphor, and that the real prostitution doesn't matter, that it's somehow less concern to God. The thing is, it's valid and it's true on both of those levels, but we can't get stuck in one or the other, and that it really has to do not with the act, but it has to do with that interior disposition. Whom do you love? What do you love? And in the case of the people of Israel, which in this case is the northern kingdom, right? Judea is where Hosea is located. So far, Judea doesn't seem to be falling prey to these temptations that they fall prey to in the northern part. Most of the two tribes of Judah, the smaller southern kingdom, then you have the northern kingdom, which is the other 10 tribes, including some on the other side of the Jordan River, like Ephraim, for example. Not one of the original tribes, Ephraim being one of the children of Joseph, who was given a share. But the tribes of the north, who are, instead of maintaining their commitment to the God who rescued them from Egypt, the God who rescued them by taking them to Egypt, the God who rescued them by taking them out of Egypt, the God who gave them this promised land, instead of bringing the worship and the adoration, and the word is cult, and it doesn't mean what we mean by cult today, but the cult of Yahweh, they were supposed to bring that in and establish that and make that the national obsession with the God who loves us and the God who preserves us and the God who strengthens our borders. They have instead decided, hey, it's much more fun to just have fun with our neighbors. We'll get along better with everybody if we just worship their gods. And and hey, their gods seem to actually do a little bit more for them than our God seems to do for us. And so they go off and they start enjoying the worship of another God. And certainly the fact that cult prostitution is part of that may be some of the draw. That it's a much more fun kind of worship than what we do when we burn whole heifers on the altar and have to drag everything down to Jerusalem periodically to the temple. So what it really represents, though, it represents an obsession with autonomy, with individuality, with independence, an obsession with self-contained knowledge and power that can be obtained through more convenient and other means than being in a relationship with a God who, because God is a person, because God is other, and it's a relationship, we don't always know what God is going to do or say. And God does and says things that are unpredictable. God does and says and asks things of us that are not coming naturally to us, and that require us to make changes, and that require us to work at changing and becoming more and more like him in the relationship. Right? This is what the Hosea's marriage symbolizes, is that difficulty God has being in love with the people that are not in love with him back. At least not in the same way, to the same extent. Sometimes if they get into trouble, they come running home, but they don't stay. They keep going, looking for easier, better gods, easier, better ways of being in the world. So they want knowledge and power without relationship. They want it without the mutual vulnerability, without the mutual submission that morally appropriate knowledge and power require. They want prosperity without community, without sharing. They want life without gratitude. They want dignity without honesty. They don't want to have to be in these difficult, awkward, sometimes demanding, and sometimes really demanding both in the sense of relationships, whether that's a relationship with somebody who is irritating, or whether it's a relationship with somebody who is so needy that it takes all of my resources that I had hoped to spend on myself. This is the kind of knowledge and power that idols promise. I can give you this, and you don't have to give up as much as you want. So that's what's going on in Hosea. Is you have God, God in that situation of the heartbroken lover, who wants and would give the best to his beloved, but his beloved doesn't stick around to receive it, and doesn't want to become the kind of person even who appreciates it, but instead goes off looking for short-term immediate benefit instead of a long-term love relationship. Well, this brings us to Saint Jerome, because this whole work of understanding the scriptures is really what he was about. Saint Jerome is he lived around in the late 300s, the early 400s, so it's a long time ago. It's around the same time as Augustine, say, and he has a correspondence with Augustine, and actually, aside from Saint Augustine, he's the most prolific writer of that period, of all of the what we call the fathers of the church. Augustine writes more than anybody else. There's just volumes upon volumes upon volumes of Augustine's writings, partly because of his situation. I mean, he was in a place where preserving written texts was possible, and he did a lot of that, and he was very verbal kind of guy. And Jerome wasn't far behind. But Saint Jerome is of importance to me personally, because he is also the patron saint of translators. He's the patron saint of biblical scholars, and I tended to relate, I think, for most of my life to the translator part, and I'm now coming to appreciate more of the biblical scholar part. He was from Dalmatia, from probably close to the coastline, the Adriatic coastline of the Balkan Peninsula, so modern-day Slovenia, Croatia, maybe Bosnia. He was known for having an irascible temperament. He was a curmudgeon, but that's not why we remember him. I mean, we remember him not because because it's good to be a curmudgeon. We remember him not because he overcame curmudgeonliness, but because he continued to struggle against it. We'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But largely, too, I mean, Jerome devoted himself to making the scriptures available, as we heard in the collect of morning prayer this morning. In a world in which the Hebrew text of the Old Testament was neglected, people tended to rely. People spoke Greek in the Mediterranean world, and it was much more probable that anybody spoke Greek than Hebrew, or could read Greek even than Hebrew. Hebrew was by that time virtually a dead language. Even the written Hebrew in which the texts, the scrolls of the Torah, the Law, and the Prophets were written, that Hebrew was not a living language. Aramaic was the language of the people. It was written with the same alphabet. There were certainly enough similarities you could pick up and recognize the similarities, but it was enough different a language that just because you spoke Aramaic did not mean you understood Hebrew as it was recorded in the Bible. So, but most people actually in the Mediterranean world, particularly among the Gentiles, they were relying on Greek translations, on one particular called the Septuagint. It was a comprehensive translation of the Old Testament texts into Greek. And most people relied on that. Gentiles relied on that. Rather than learning Hebrew, they just read the Greek, because everybody knew Greek. If you were educated, you read Greek. So people relied on this Greek translation, and there were books in the Septuagint in the Greek Old Testament that were not even there in the Hebrew text. That the Palestinian collection, what we call the canon, the Palestinian canon, was different from the canon of the diaspora Jews who used who had some additional books, some of the stories that we talked about yesterday for St. Michael and All Angels, the Book of Tobit, for example. There are some of the wisdom literature. That exists only in Greek and probably was originally composed in Greek. But Jerome, in a move that irritated a lot of people in his day, insisted that some of this Greek translation was maybe not the best, and he went out of his way to learn Hebrew. He found a rabbi who could teach him Hebrew, and he went and moved to the Holy Land so that he could be where he had the access to not just to records and books and information, but where there was a closer relationship to that Hebrew text, and where it was easier to get a handle on what things might have meant in this Hebrew text. And he introduced some suggestions for correction in that text. It was not popular. If we look at the Lord's Prayer, for example, even in Greek, right, give us this day our daily bread. That word daily is problematic. It actually only occurs one other place in the entire corpus we have of recorded Greek literature. That word for daily only exists in one other place than it does, plus beyond, aside from this use in the Lord's Prayer. And so there's considerable debate about what this means. By the time Jerome is living and working, everybody's gotten used to thinking it as synonymous with the Latin word quotidianum, meaning daily. Give us this day our daily bread. And it makes some sense in that context. It tracks kind of with what Jesus is saying and doing and so on. But Jerome is saying, yeah, that doesn't quite do it. That doesn't quite capture it. The word, even in Greek. But if you look at what it might have come from in Aramaic as Jesus would have spoken it, that it probably meant something different. Something, give us this day bread that goes beyond substance. Supersubstantial was the word that he used in Latin. Give us our supersubstantial bread. And they tried that in the liturgy, and everybody got mad. It's like, no, we're used to saying daily. We're not going to say anything else. We're going to say this has cropped up again recently in the Roman Catholic Church with the revision of some of the translations of the vernacular texts that everybody became familiar with shortly after Vatican II. There's a Vox Clara commission that was founded and to try to make the English text track a little better with the Latin editio typica, the standard edition. That is the Latin basis from which all the other translations get made. Most of the other translations already were there. English was the one that really did go above and beyond what the actual Latin text said. But the corrections don't sit well with anybody because they're used to saying it, and they have built their lives around understanding what these mistranslations mean, and they're resistant to absorbing the sense, the newer sense, the other sense. And granted, it sounds Latinate and it's awkward to the ear. But nevertheless, there's a point there in terms of translation, and that resonates with me as the translator. So Jerome worked very hard on understanding and making understood the scriptures of the Old Testament, as well as he did a little bit of work on the Gospels. And what he did, I think probably that was most beneficial, was that he went, instead of working from the Greek texts and then putting those into vernacular Latin, there was already an edition that had a translation of scriptures that had been made from Greek into vernacular Latin. It's called the Vetus Latina, the old Latin text. Jerome started with the Hebrew and made his translation into Latin directly from the Hebrew, and put that into vernacular Latin, or vulgar Latin as it was called. Vulgus means the common people. Latin as it is actually spoken, as opposed to the Latin of the classical Latin writers, Cicero and Homer and so on. Jerome was a classicist. He was trained as a classicist. He went to Rome before he became a Christian. He went to Rome to study rhetoric, to study, the good use of language for all purposes, for persuasion, for entertainment, for all of these things. He went to Rome to immerse himself in Cicero and to learn how to write the way Cicero did. But he became a Christian, and then his concern became slightly different. His concern, he was absorbed with the scriptures. He became a monk. He became a Christian. He became a monk, a hermit monk, actually. And then, but nevertheless, his passion for the scriptures, and probably something in that linguistic background of his, kept reasserting itself. He learned Hebrew so that he could understand better. He moved to the Holy Land so that he could have an atmosphere, an environment in which to understand better. And so he devoted himself to this. So he made a translation into Vulgar Latin called the Vulgate, and that remains, again, still an important source of understanding for us of what the Hebrew text would have meant according to his researches closer to the time. Because again, even the codices, the texts that we have, the copies that we have, and the understandings that we have, again, down through the ages, things get lost, things get forgotten. So Jerome has reminded us, and he's left this memorial of what the text meant as he was able to discern it at the time, and it's an important resource. So I'll just conclude with an anecdote. A couple of years ago, Judith and I went down to Washington, D.C., and we one of the things we did while we were there was we visited the Museum of the Bible, which is fascinating. It is one of the best museums I have ever been to. It's amazing. But there's one whole floor that's devoted to the Bible through the ages, in other words, the Bible in translation in many respects. And there's a whole exhibit on Jerome because of his role in this. And they have these things where you go to different parts, and they have this wonderful sound system where if you're standing in a particular place, you hear a text. Sometimes it's a reading of that particular language version of the Bible and so on. But they have this one exhibit on Saint Jerome, and they have this wonderful passage, which took me a long time to research and track down. But it's preserved from what was probably the oldest thing that Saint Jerome himself wrote, which is a letter to his friend Innocentius, an old college friend from the Roman days when they were students of rhetoric together in Rome, before Jerome was converted. And Innocentius has also become Christian. And Innocentius has written to Jerome because word has started to circulate about a miracle that has happened in I forget the name of the town, in the north of Italy, close to the Alps. And Innocent has been begging Jerome to send him a report of this miracle. It has to do with a man and a woman who were accused of adultery. They were tortured. The guy caved in and just to get it over with said, "Yes, we did it," and so on. The woman continues to maintain her innocence through torture. They finally just, the torture is not enough. She's still maintaining her innocence. They decide finally they're just going to execute her. They take her out. They can't execute her. The guy who's going to lop off, the soldier who's going to lop off her head, the sword stops at her neck. He tries to stab her with it. The sword bends and curves over. They bring in somebody else with another sword, and meanwhile she's like, "Oh, you dropped your brooch there," and she is being kind to even her executioner, but can't be killed. And then they bring in somebody else who seems to be able to at least draw enough blood so that she dies. They're not able to lop off her head, but they draw enough blood so that they think she's dead. They take her to bury her. She gets revived. She comes back to life again. And and all the whole while, she's maintaining her innocence here. She's maintaining that she has not been unfaithful to her husband, who is the one who accused her. And Jerome is just marveling at her integrity and writes with great eloquence about this. And in the end, she revives, and they They take her off, and they take her to live with some other sisters, some virgins, in other words, some women who have decided to live a common life of prayer together, the predecessors of our nuns. And they take her there, and she, in order to essentially hide out, because of course now she's a wanted woman, they take her. She changes her identity and so on, and eventually goes on to live. But the other thing that gets discovered in the midst of this is that there is an old woman in the Christian community there who, at the time this woman was going to be executed, died. And so the idea that we share our lives to such an extent that I could die your death, or that you might die my death. And whose death will you die? And who died so that you might live? Right? It's a wonderful thing. There's a short, I'm getting way off field here, a wonderful short story called Mother and the Flying Saucer. It's a Christmas story, actually, but it has to do with that same thing. But anyway, that's neither here. The whole point with Jerome is that Innocentius has been begging him for a report, and Jerome is like, "No, I don't want to do this. I don't do that kind of stuff anymore. I don't write, journalism pieces anymore. It's not what I do." But finally, he relents. But what he writes in that first letter to Innocentius really sets the tone for, I think, his lifelong work. And it really speaks to me, too, as someone who's, had a lifelong career in translation. But also in my work as a priest. And I think this speaks not just to me. I think this speaks to many of us, trying to be faithful to our Christian calling when the whole world is accusing us that it's of doing something bad precisely by our fidelity to Christ, and precisely by trying to do our best with it and not really being able to do very well in it. So Jerome writes, he says, "The task is beyond me, and yet I dare not decline it." This is the passage that I heard in the Museum of the Bible at the Jerome exhibit. "The task is beyond me, and yet I dare not decline it. I am a mere unskilled passenger, and I find myself placed in charge of a freighted ship. I have not so much as handled a rowboat on a lake, and now I have to trust myself to the noise and turmoil of the Black Sea. I see the shores sinking beneath the horizon, sea and sky on every side. Darkness lowers over the water. The clouds are as black as night. Only the waves are white, and they with foam. And you urge me to hoist the swelling sails, to loosen the sheets, and to take the helm. And at last I obey your commands, and as charity can do all things, I will trust in the Holy Ghost to guide my course, and I shall console myself, whatever the event. For if our ship is wafted by the surf into the wished-for haven, I shall be content to be told that the pilotage was poor. But if, through my unpolished diction, we run aground amid the rough cross-currents of language, you may blame my lack of power, but you will at least recognize my good intentions." And this, I think, foreshadows his life as a scholar of the Bible, as a translator, as a commentator. He fights hard for his convictions about the text of the Bible. He shares his understanding persuasively, and yet at the same time he also struggles his entire life as with his inner curmudgeon, right? The fact that he's a saint doesn't mean that he succeeds. You read Jerome's writings, and you will find his favorite targets are heretics, Jews, worldly women, and the institution of marriage. He has no need for any of those things, right? And some of the things he writes we can recognize might be witty, and some are even sort of borderline funny in a cruel kind of way, but a lot of them are just plain ugly and crass and crude. But what sets Jerome apart as a saint is that he never turns around and insists that, well, because I can't help myself, therefore this is good, or this is just a part of me, or God wants me this way, or it should be overlooked. He never goes there. He repents daily of it. And he understands the good news that if he is saved, it isn't because he is really a good person underneath, despite this deceptively rough exterior or the occasional flaw or failing or weakness. He understands that he does not deserve the gracious blessing that God has lavished upon him in allowing him to be swept up into the life of Jesus Christ. He knows that what Jesus Christ did, it was so powerful, it could save even a sinner as bad as himself. That's what makes Jerome a saint. It is what makes all of us worthy of the title saint. And it is in our constant recognition of that, our gratitude, our acceptance of mercy, that breaks us and draws us to recognize that we achieve far more than we could have asked or imagined, not by our own rights, not by dint of our own will, but rather because God has seen us and had mercy on us. God expresses himself chiefly in showing mercy and pity. And we are the beneficiaries of that. We give thanks for that. And we are witnesses of that in the world. So that, my brothers and sisters, is my morning musing for the day. Thank you for listening. And I hope you'll join me again at 5 o'clock for evening prayer. We have our vestry meeting tonight at 7. If you're on the vestry, please join us for prayer as well. Don't just come to the vestry meeting, but join us for prayer so that we can come and come together really in that primary and foremost awareness that we meet and do everything that we say and do here precisely because of and for the love of God. So join us in that. And in the meantime, if you're not on the vestry, please pray for us. Please pray for me. Please pray for this technology. Pray that it all gets itself sorted out. And then I will in turn assure you that I pray for you, and we'll be back here. And in the meantime, pray that God will bless you and give you every good grace until we meet again.